The Chat Completions API versus the Assistance API. Both of these APIs were written by OpenAI, and in this presentation we're going to go over both of these APIs so you understand what they are and when to use them. So why are we even doing this comparison? With each passing day, the models that are created by OpenAI keep getting more powerful and powerful. We all know this. But the way you access these models is also changing. Initially, we were offered the Completions API, which is a very simple API to use, but there are many pitfalls to this API that made it more difficult to start developing more complex pieces of software around these OpenAI models. Introducing the Assistance API. The Assistance API was created by OpenAI to address many of the growing issues with the Completions API. The main purpose of the Assistance API was to fix some of the things that were missing in the Completions API. What we know from the evolution of the Chat Completions API to the Assistance API is that the demand to use these APIs is continuing to grow, and the software that we are building on these APIs continues to grow in complexity. So what is the Completions API? The Completions API is a very simple API to use to generate text from a prompt using a large language model. The prompting is typically done with a list of messages, and each message is given a role. And that role is either a user, an assistant, or a developer. A user is a user, and the assistant is a response back from the models, and the developer is a role used by developers to tell the models how to behave. The Completions API is also stateless by design, meaning that the model's context of the conversation must be included in the message's payload. What this means is that as these conversations continue on, these messages will grow in size, and so will your requests. It's also synchronous by design, meaning that when you request a text completion from OpenAI using the Completions API, you must sit and wait for the response. Otherwise, you risk losing the response data. What are some sample use cases of the Completions API? You can use the Completions API to generate a tweet or a Facebook post. You can also use the Completions API to summarize a long body of text. So think of a chapter book. You could tell the Completions API to summarize the first chapter of this book and then upload the first chapter of the book through the files, and allow the Completions API to give you a bulleted point list of the key points to take away from the first chapter. You can use it as a way to do a simple question and answering system as an alternative to Google. And in the wild, you will see this happening with ChatGPT. You could technically rebuild the UI of ChatGPT with the Completions API, right? And develop a system that allows users to come and ask the model questions. And what's interesting is that this process is replacing the term Googling. People are no longer Googling things, they're going to ChatGPT and ChatGPTing things. And that's all thanks to the Completions API. It's also a great resource for developers to generate small units of code. Don't tell the Completions API to develop you an Airbnb clone. It won't work. But if you tell it to generate a single method with a narrow scope, it will do a great job at doing that. It's also great as a learning tool. If you are struggling with math or science, you can use the Completions API to help you solve some tricky equations or help you understand complex scientific topics. So what are some pros and cons to the Completions API? It's super simple to use. It's very flexible. You're not constrained to a specific workflow like you will see in the Assistance API. It's stateless in nature, making it really good at doing these ad hoc text generations. And it's very cost effective, and you can use it across a wide variety of models created by OpenAI. So what are the negatives? The developer is responsible for managing the state of these conversations, okay? The available tools, or tool calls, as they commonly refer to it, must be passed with each request. Okay, so as conversations get larger, the messages list gets larger, meaning your request payload size grows. And then to add insult to injury, if you want to use tool calls, you have to include the list of tools with each request. It's also stateless in nature. It's both a pro and a con. It being stateless in nature makes it difficult to manage the conversation context for more complex workflows. And lastly, it being synchronous in nature can be viewed as a negative. I'm not saying that the Completions API cannot operate at scale. I'm simply saying that the Assistant API is better designed to operate at scale. The Assistance API. So the Assistance API obviously was a solution to more complex OpenAI integrations where it addressed the major pitfalls of the Completions API. The prompting is typically done through the concept of threads and runs, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we get into the code. It's stateful by design, so it makes it significantly easier to manage conversations because the conversations are stored on OpenAI servers via these threads, okay? Meaning that you can carry on multiple independent conversations simultaneously using the Assistance API. It's also asynchronous by design. This is a great thing for developers because it allows us to create more complex pieces of software where we can free up compute resources and check on the process of our request when we are ready to. So what are some sample use cases? And before I dig into these sample use cases, I'm going to add a caveat. Any of these use cases can also be developed by the Completions API. All I'm stating when I list out these use cases is that I believe these specific use cases are better suited for the Assistance API rather than the Completions API. So the Assistance API is great for building out complex workflows that require you to access external resources like a database or a REST API. Okay? That's because the tools only need to be provided to the assistant one time. You don't have to provide it with each request, much like you do with the Completions API. You could build something like a customer support bot. Imagine if you had a website and there was a chat bot in the bottom right-hand corner. That chat bot could be given a list of files that have specific product information that is proprietary to your company and the models are not trained on, right? So it has context of information that it would not otherwise have. And it could help answer questions for each individual customer, okay? And each individual customer would operate in their own thread, meaning their conversation is isolated from everyone else. And the assistant gets the benefit from having consistent access to the files and resources that it needs to answer the customer's questions without having to re-upload them with every message request. And as a developer, could you imagine? That would be a horrible, horrible, horrible experience. It would be almost unusable otherwise. You could also develop some sort of Q&A bot for students. Let's say an instructor is teaching some bespoke topic that's not well known, right? Maybe they're teaching, I don't know, ancient Egyptian language. You're not going to find tons of that on Google, I would imagine. You might, I don't know. But the point is that you can upload a bunch of files to the Assistance API, and once the files are uploaded to the Assistance API, it can be used as a reference in all future requests without having to re-upload the file. It's also great for workflow orchestration. So let's say you have a website for job postings and you are receiving a bunch of applications from candidates for a job posting. You could build a system where it flags certain candidates as more eligible than others due to their job history. For example, let's say we are hiring for a vehicle mechanic. We can automatically promote candidates who have experience maintaining vehicles. Otherwise, all the software engineers can go kick rocks because they don't know anything about a car engine, right? And that would be possible through the Assistance API, okay? Much more easily, because you can reach out to external resources and flag a user record or a candidate record as more eligible than another, okay? That's all I'm saying. Lastly, you could develop some sort of system where you're developing a moderator for your Shopify product reviews, for example. Let's say we built a moderator that fact-checked these reviews to make sure that the reviews are fair and the reviews are not spam or have inappropriate content, that kind of thing. And then we could also give that particular assistant agency to ban maybe an IP address from our website. So what are some pros and cons to the Assistance API? It's designed for complex workflows. It's designed for tool calls in mind, meaning you only have to provide the tool specifications one time. It's stateful in nature, allowing you to have multiple independent conversations. And it's also asynchronous by design and highly scalable. Now, what are the negatives? Again, you wouldn't want to use the Assistance API if you're just doing simple ad hoc text completion tasks like generating a tweet. It also takes a little bit more time to learn how to use, right? So there is some developers spend up time to figure out how to use the Assistance API. I would say that if it takes a developer 1 hour to understand the Completions API, it would take them 2 hours to understand the Assistance API. It also has a more rigid workflow, meaning that you have to better understand the actual behavior or workflows going on the OpenAI side of things. And you'll see that in the coding example. You have to understand the state of a run and what each state means, so on and so forth. And lastly, it's still technically in beta. Not beta, but beta. However, I've been using the Assistance API for over a year now, and I have not had a single issue with it, and I'm absolutely surprised that it's still in beta status. So with all that being said, we've done a general overview of the Completions API and the Assistance API. We understand some of the pros and cons of each, but I think getting into some code is a more exciting way to learn about this, so let's jump into it. All right, now for the fun part. We're jumping into some code. On the left-hand side, I have a completions.py file, and on the right-hand side, I have an assistance.py file. Obviously, I'm using Python for this demonstration, but the general ideas apply across whatever tech stack you're using, and I already have all my dependencies and API keys set up. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the Completions API. And what you're going to notice as I go through this is how simple it is to actually get started with the Completions API. It's great for those ad hoc text generation type tasks. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called result, and we are going to call the client.chat.completions user.create method. Now there's two fields that are required on this completions create method. First, we're going to need to tell OpenAI what model we want to use, which we're going to use GPT-4o. And then we need to give it an array of messages. Okay, so in our array of messages, this is what I was talking about earlier with regards to the completions API is stateless in nature, meaning that every time you make a call to this create method, you're going to have to give it a complete list of the messages up into that point of the conversation. So if you have a long running conversation with a user, you're going to constantly be getting the messages from the previous results of the create call and then appending a new message to the end of it, right? But we're not going to really get too deeply into that. But all I want you to understand is that the model is not going to understand anything about any previous conversation unless it's in the messages array with every single request. I repeat, with every single request. So that's what I was also meaning by the request payload size is going to continue to grow with time. Okay, so anyway, a message consists of two parts, a role and the message content. So there's three roles. There's the developer role, the user role, and the assistant role. The developer role is used to give the model instructions on how to behave. The user is reserved for the user, and the assistant role is obviously reserved for responses back from OpenAI. So in this particular example, we're going to go ahead and set our first message to a developer role, and then we're going to tell the model that you're going to assume this identity of a historian that likes to share cool facts. You are a historian that loves to share cool facts. But you must use Generation Alpha's lingo to keep the user engaged. Okay? So next, we want to actually give the model a question, right? So we're going to use and I just transpose that. We're going to use the user role, meaning this is me speaking to the model. And I'm going to say, what cool facts can you tell me about 1999? All right. Now, we obviously want to see our results. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here and we're going to print the last message that we get back. So the last message we get back is going to be the first element in the choices array. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's run this completions.py file and see what we get back. We're waiting on a response. And then we get a message back from our model, right? And I chose to be kind of silly with our instructions given to the model because I'm trying to prove a point, right? So the developer role, we told the historian that you need to assume this identity of this cool Gen Alpha guy that's going to teach history to other Gen Alpha people, right? So you can see in the response back that the model says, all right, fam, let's throw it back to 1999, a year that was totally lit with some major vibes that helped shape the world we know today, right? And so on and so forth. You can pause the video and read this nonsense, but it is what it is. The only thing I really want you to understand with the Completions API is that look how simple it is to use, right? It didn't take a whole lot to get started. it only has context of the conversation up until if that context is inside the messages array. So back up, the model doesn't have context if it's not inside this messages array. So if I come back here and ask it, what was the last question I asked, right? I am going to get some sort of response back saying, you didn't ask me nothing, right? Sorry, I'm not able to remember previous questions, but I'm here to help you out with whatever awesome info you need, right? It's because we didn't append the results of the last create call to the messages array, nor did we include our original question in the messages array. So the model had no idea what we were talking about because its context is limited to the given array of the request. So also remember that as you continue to go through these conversations, this messages array is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And if it just keeps growing forever, you're eventually going to hit a limit where OpenAI is going to start rejecting your requests because your requests are too large, basically, in a nutshell, okay? So just keep that in mind, all right? Jumping over to the assistance API. So this is going to be significantly different, okay? It's going to be a little bit more confusing. That's what I talked about in our pros and cons, or our positives and negatives, right? One of the negatives of the assistance API is that it takes a little bit more time to get spun up on how to use, okay? And then in addition to that, it uses a different asynchronous model using threads and runs. And you'll see that going forward. So let's get to it. So let's say thread equals client.beta.threads.create, and then I'm actually going to print that thread ID, okay? Because I'm going to need that later on in our demonstration. So if I execute the Python assistance.py file, every time I do that, I'm going to get a new thread ID. You can see each time I'm getting a new thread, okay? This ID is changing right here. So I'm actually going to save this thread ID, this last one, for purposes later, okay? As part of the demo later. I'm gonna save that for now because it's still good. But moving on. So threads have messages on them. So you can think of it as a message thread. So this array over here in the completions API is really can be related to a thread with a bunch of messages on it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a message to this thread. So we can call client.beta.threads.messages.create, and we need to pass in a thread ID. And I'm just going to use the thread ID of whatever one we're creating on the fly for the time being. I'm not going to use that thread ID that I have saved up here. In fact, I might just comment that out now for clarity's sake, okay? And then we want to say, hey, we're the user role, and the content of this message is what cool events occurred in 1999. All right, so we have this thread we create, and then we throw a message on this thread, similar to how we added a message in the array over here. Now we need to actually execute this thread. Now, when we send these threads and these messages to the threads to OpenAI, OpenAI is not going to do anything with that thread until you tell it to run the thread. So we're going to create a run call using the client.beta.threads.runs.create, and we're going to say, hey, we want to run this thread ID with this assistant ID. And I went ahead and created an assistant prior to this, okay? And I could show you in another video how to do that, but for the sake of simplicity, just assume that the assistant is already made, because it is. All right, so What's going to happen here is if I run Python assistance.py, it's going to exit pretty quickly, right? Because it's asynchronous in nature. That run is running in the background inside of OpenAI's compute infrastructure. It's not running in the background of your computer, but it's running in the background of the OpenAI servers, so to speak. So what we need to do is we need to long pull the service, the OpenAI Assistance API, to see if the run is complete. So we want to go ahead and print the run status. We're going to wait for the run status to enter a completed state, and then we want to sleep for 2 seconds because we don't need to hit it super fast. Hit the API super fast, and then we want to actually get that run updated state back. So let's do threads. The IntelliSense autocomplete is failing me right now, but that's okay. All right. Okay, moving forward, and then once that run status reaches a state of complete, then the messages should be updated in theory, right? So client.beta.threads.messages.list, and then we're going to pull all the messages off that thread ID. Okay. And then for every message in messages, we're going to print the message.content. Okay, so now let's execute our assistance.py file and see what happens. We created a new thread. We created a message on that thread, and we started executing a run. Now that run entered a queued state, meaning OpenAI is waiting to process it. It went into in progress, which means OpenAI is now processing our request, our run request. And now we are waiting on the response back. Okay, so we see that we got a list of messages back, and as we expected, we have an actual response back from the model. 1999 was a year filled with significant events in various fields, blah, 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 blah. You can start pausing it and reading this all you want, okay? Just know that that's how the Assistance API works. It's asynchronous in nature, and you have to long pull it. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons to that. We're not going to get too deep into it, but it does allow you to do a lot, to start building out much more sophisticated software. So, for example, we have that thread ID that was just created. Let's go ahead and pretend like we saved that thread ID, okay? So we don't need to create a thread anymore, because let's assume we saved that thread ID for this conversation to a database somewhere, and we came back 2 minutes later, right? Let's go ahead and replace every thread.id to thread_id. And then let's go ahead and ask the model now, what was the last question I asked you? Okay, so we pulled the thread ID from our previous execution of this assistance.py file. And what I want you to understand from all this, and what I'm driving at, is that Assistance API is stateful in nature, unlike Completions API, which is stateless in nature. So the Assistance API is able to pick back up where it left off, so to speak. So if I actually go and I run the assistance.py file again, we should get a response back from the Assistance API stating that what was the last question I asked you, and the last question we asked, according to the model, was you asked about the cool events in 1999. So you see the statefulness of the Assistance API in action. And then as you're looking at my logs here, you're also seeing the asynchronous nature of the Assistance API in action. Now, if you want to learn more about how to use the Assistance API, make sure you subscribe to the channel and you hit that bell icon to get notified of new updates, and also like the video as well. But I plan on making much more content about how to build very sophisticated OpenAI integrations around the Assistants API, because I'm a big fan of it. I'm surprised a lot more people are not using it yet. I think you're missing out on a totally awesome piece of this OpenAI experience, okay? So, in conclusion, on the left-hand side, we did our completions API example. We saw how simple it was, how stateless it is, and how synchronous it is in nature, right? And on the right-hand side, we saw how the Assistants API is a little bit more powerful. It's asynchronous and it's stateful in nature, but it's also a little bit more involved when it comes to actually using it, right? So on the left-hand side, we have 16 lines of code that's including imports. And then on the right-hand side, we have 33 lines of code including imports. So it's, double, right? So, but yeah, I hope this example was helpful for you. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, because I would love to answer them to the best of my ability for you.